Habakkuk chapter 2. We'll look at the first 5 verses here tonight. Habakkuk 2, verse 1, he writes, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision, and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak, and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, and it will not tarry. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man. Neither keepeth at home, who enlarges his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. We're going to stop right there. Now, if you remember back to last week, chapter 1 ends with Habakkuk being bewildered. He is bewildered by the fact that God was going to use a wicked people in Babylon to be the means of judgment against a less wicked people in Judah. And so, if you remember, he uses this analogy of a fisherman fishing in a pond, and he sticks in his hook and he throws in his net and he gathers all these fish, and then he bows down to worship the implements that he is using, and then he empties his nets and he just does it all over again. He's just devouring, constantly devouring. And so basically Habakkuk is telling God, if you allow this to happen, Babylon, these wicked people are just going to keep on devouring nations. They're going to keep on being wicked. They're going to keep on rejecting you. They're going to keep on, doing these things that these pagans do. And so, he can't understand. He's having trouble grasping how God could allow such a thing to take place, right? And we talked about this last week, how Habakkuk really becomes really relevant and relatable in this particular manner. And so this chapter then, chapter 2, begins with him comparing himself to a sentinel, right? He's a watcher. He's a sentinel upon a wall, just watching out for someone to ride up to the city. In this particular case, Habakkuk as the sentinel is waiting and watching for the answer of God towards his objections, right? God, how could you, right? That's basically what he's saying at the end of chapter 1. And so here in chapter 2, he's planted himself upon this wall and just saying, God, I'm just going to wait. I don't understand, and I'm just going to wait on the answer to come. And so he says, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and I will watch to see what he will say to me. And then he says this, and what I shall answer when I'm reproved. And so not only does Habakkuk not understand, but as Habakkuk in the office of prophet, he knows that other people are going to come to him seeking for answers. And basically at this point he's saying, I don't know what to tell them. I don't have an answer to give them. And so not only am I waiting for the answer to my own questions, I'm waiting for questions, or rather answers that I can give to other people. And so, again, he's just going to sit back and he's going to wait, which is the right thing and proper thing for him to do, to patiently wait on the answer of God. Now, God's answer did come, and that starts in verse number 2. And God tells Habakkuk here to make it plain. He says, write the vision and make it plain upon tables. And then he says that he may run that readeth it. And so Habakkuk is going to receive this answer, and it's going to be a clear answer. And he needs to write it down just as clearly as he received it, so that not only he can understand it, but so that everybody else who reads it can understand it. And you get this really from the end of verse 2. And this is a debated phrase. People question the exact interpretation of this. But he says, make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. And so again, it's a little bit debated as to the exact meaning of that phrase. But what is clear is that the running is the result of the reading, right? It doesn't say that he will read who runs with it. No, it says he will run that reads it. And so what is the most likely option is that this clear answer from God that Habakkuk has received and has written down plainly and clearly as God has given to him, that people are seeing this writing of Habakkuk, and this message is so powerful and clear that they must go immediately and start telling other people about what they have just read. Not dissimilar to the woman at the well. Remember when Jesus has his dealings with her, and then she immediately goes and just starts telling everybody, hey, come listen to this man who's told me everything I've ever done. right? And so the message was impacted her in such a manner that she immediately went out and started telling others. And so it seems like this is the same. It's the same sort of event here. But now we're not going to get to the actual message of God tonight, because what God does here in verse 3 is before he gives Habakkuk the actual answer to his prayer, God has an important a message that he's going to give to Habakkuk, kind of to prepare him for the answer to his prayer. And so he begins here in verse 3. He says, "Now, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, and it will not tarry." And so here's the gist of this. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. And so God is telling Habakkuk, listen, I've heard your prayers. I've heard your cries. I've listened to you. I know you think I'm not paying attention. I know you think I'm just removed and uninvolved and all these things are going on. We talked about last week how Habakkuk is complaining that God's not listening, when God was literally at that moment moving nations in order to answer the prayer of Habakkuk, right? But now God's, he's telling him, I know you think I'm uninvolved, but listen, I've got a will about this. There are things in play right now that are going to be the answer eventually to your prayer, but you need to know that my timeline is not your timeline, right? The answer to this prayer is going to come, but it's going to come at the appointed time. He says, now when it comes, it will be exactly what it needs to be. It will be the exact answer to your prayer. He says, at the end it shall speak, right? It will not lie. It will be everything it needs to be, but it's just not going to be now. Now, when it happens, it's going to happen, and it's going to be quick. It says right now it's tearing. Right now it seems like it's waiting, and it's not coming as fast as you might think. He says, but it will come, and when it comes, it will not tarry. Basically, when the answer starts to happen, it's going to happen quickly. But again, the key is the beginning of verse 3. It's at this appointed time. And so what God was going to tell him was not going to happen immediately. He's going to give him a vision of things that were going to happen in the future. It was going to happen exactly when God determined for it to happen, not when Habakkuk wanted it to happen, right? And this, again, is a very important thing for us as Christians today to understand. When we're praying to God, God has answers to our prayers. Now, sometimes those answers aren't what we want. And sometimes God says, yes, that answer will come, but not now. And so sometimes he does answer our prayers. And sometimes, or rather, sometimes he does answer our prayers how we want him to answer them, but just not when we want him to answer them. Right? But it's all determined by God. It's all up to God's sovereign will. It's all up to God's sovereign timeline. It's not up to us. And so this is the message that God is trying to get across to Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk, like most of us, if not all of us, he wanted answers now. Right? Habakkuk is looking around at all this wickedness. He's looking around at Babylon. He's looking around at the people of Judah, and he's seeing just wickedness everywhere. And he's saying, God, how could you, right? How could you wait? How could you not do something about this? This must happen now, right? And so he's saying, God, it doesn't make sense. I don't understand why you would wait. And so nothing else made sense to him. The only thing that made to Habakkuk's mind is that God must judge this, and he must judge it now, and he must judge it in the way I think it should be judged. And we're all guilty of this same kind of thinking, right? We're all guilty of this exact same line of thinking, that God, I'm praying about something, and the answer seems so obvious to me that I believe that the answer must be this, and it must happen now. And anything outside of that, God, I just don't understand how you could do such a thing. Right? And so this is the situation that Habakkuk finds himself in. However, the answer to Habakkuk's prayer was all going to unfold, but it was all going to unfold according to the will of God, not the will of Habakkuk. And so Habakkuk's job was not to know the timeline of God. Right? This is something he had to understand. This is why God gives him this message. Right? Habakkuk, your job as a prophet is to foretell the message that I give to you. Your job as a prophet is not to know everything that I know. That's not your job. And so Habakkuk's job was not to know the timeline of God. It was simply to be faithful while he patiently waited for God's will to come to pass. Right? And that's verse 4. Verse 4 is probably the most well-known verse of Habakkuk. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him. But he says this, but the just shall live by his faith. And so again, Habakkuk, you don't have to know when everything's going to happen. You don't even have to know everything that's going to happen. What you do have to do is live in faith while you're patiently waiting on it to happen. And so this is the message that God has for him. I'll quote Ralph Smith. He said, Habakkuk, like all of us, was living between the times, between the promise and the fulfillment. Habakkuk was to wait in faith for God to act. He was assured that judgment on evil would surely come. It will not be late. But Habakkuk was not to wait with folded hands and bated breath for all this to happen. He was to live a life of faithfulness. The evil one is puffed up with pride, and he will fall, but the righteous will live by being faithful to his covenant with God. And so again, it was very important for God to get this particular message to Habakkuk before giving them the answer. Because if he had just given them the answer, it might have led into Habakkuk's thinking that it was going to happen immediately. And so God's simply telling them, no, Habakkuk, listen, it's not going to take place immediately. There's a time appointed for this, but what I expect from you right now is to just be faithful. And so you have this phrase at the end of verse 4, the just shall live by his faith. Now this is obviously an important phrase. Not only is it kind of the theme of the book of Habakkuk, but also this particular phrase is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. And each time, interestingly enough, each time it is quoted in the New Testament, it emphasizes a different aspect of this phrase. And so in Romans chapter 1, Paul writes this. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then he says this, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And so in Romans chapter 1, Paul is emphasizing the just aspect of it. For the just shall live by faith. Here he uses the word righteous, and he's emphasizing the same thing. And so for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. And so essentially what he's saying is faith produces righteousness, right? Faith produces righteousness. And in this particular case, in both Jews and Greeks. That's what Paul's trying to emphasize here. And so the just shall live by faith. Faith produces righteousness. And then Paul quotes it again in his epistle to the Galatians. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, he says, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. And so here the emphasis is in the living portion of this. The just shall live by faith. And so what he's doing is he's saying that nobody is going to live by living a rigorous confirmation to the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law in of itself does not produce eternal life. It can't produce eternal life. The only thing that produces eternal life is faith. And so if life is the desire, then faith is what gives eternal life. And so he's just comparing the new covenant to the old there in Galatians chapter 3. And then another place in the New Testament by the author of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38, now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. And so in this particular verse, faith then is the emphasis. In other words, if reward is going to happen upon the son or daughter of God, it is going to happen through the faith of that individual. Not by the works of that individual, but faith. Now, faith produces works, but faith is the foundation. And then, of course, that leads right into Hebrews chapter 11, which is that great faith chapter talking about the faith of these Old Testament saints. And so, again, we can't overemphasize the importance of this small phrase that originates here and yet has a strong showing in the New Testament. Now, here's what it comes down to. Habakkuk could not control the wickedness around him, nor could he force himself to understand the plan of God. What he could do is determine to live by faith in the one who was in control and the one who did have all understanding. That's what God was asking of Habakkuk. And as I was putting this together this week, I thought back to various conversations I've had with my kids over the years where I was trying to explain something to them and they just didn't get it. And eventually, several times, I've told my kids this, listen, just trust me. Just trust me. And in that moment, I was not expecting them to have perfect knowledge. I was not expecting them to control their environment or to control their circumstances. But what I was expecting them to do is place their faith in the one who could. Is to place their faith in the one who did understand what was going on. And to place their faith in the one who could control their environment, right? And so again, I wasn't expecting them to do it all. And here's what God is telling Habakkuk. It's the same thing. You don't control what's going on around you. You don't control the wickedness. You don't get to bring in the sword and just wipe everything out and start over fresh. You don't get to do that. You don't control your environment, nor do I expect you to perfectly understand my plan. You are not omniscient. You're not going to get it all. You're going to get only the pieces that I give to you, and only you can understand it in as best as a human can. Right? You're not going to get all of this. I don't expect you to get all that. The only thing that I expect, and further, I should say, the only thing that I require is that even when you can't control it, and even when you don't understand it all, you simply have faith in the one who can. Right? That's what God is requiring of Habakkuk. I require you to live by faith. We read this several weeks ago in 1 Corinthians, but 1 Corinthians 4:2, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. That's what's required. What is required of Christians? To be faithful. Now, the truth, which was a truth that Habakkuk knew, which led him to this consternation that he had, the truth was that Babylon had transgressed, that Babylon was proud, that Babylon wanted to destroy all nations. And you see this clearly in verse 5. You say, yea, also, because he transgresseth, and this is Babylon, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, that word there being Sheol, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto himself all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. I'll quote Constable here. He said, the proud person is never satisfied, like death that consumes people every day and never stops. Here, Sheol, again, the Hebrew word for hell in the verse, the grave, is a personification of death, in which Habakkuk ascribed human actions to an inanimate object. Babylon was similar, opening wide its jaws to consume all peoples. The proud person also seeks to dominate others, and this too marked Babylon. These were the evidences of Babylon's pride and the basis for Yahweh's indictment of this nation. Now, this is what Habakkuk could see. Again, this is what led to him objecting to God's supposed absence, right? To God's supposed flippant attitude towards the wickedness around him. And so he could clearly see this. He knew this. But what Habakkuk should have known, what he should have recognized, and what should have been the impetus for the faith that he should have displayed, was that God is holy, and because he is holy, unrighteousness will not go unpunished. Right? And so again, he could see the unrighteousness. There was no doubting that. But what he should have known, and what should have led to his actions, instead of the wickedness, what should have led to his actions was the holiness of God. And knowing that a holy God is not going to allow this stuff to go unpunished. And because God is holy, and because he won't allow unrighteousness to go unpunished, what we will see next week is that he then pronounces 5 woes, and woe simply being a term for judgment. He pronounces 5 woes upon the nation of Babylon. And so we'll see those woes next week. But again, what Habakkuk was allowing to drive his questioning of God was the actions of man instead of the nature of a holy God. Right? And so he was getting this upside down. He wasn't wrong per se about either, but instead of allowing what was around him to control his questioning of God, he should have allowed the nature of God to control what he was doing about the things that were happening around him. And so again, Habakkuk is a immensely, I think, interesting prophet, and we'll see how he reacts to this news to God in the coming week.